Fantastic.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stearns Policy Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. Hudson's mission is to promote American leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future. And as we look at what drives a secure, free, and prosperous future, U.S. technological leadership is key. Herman Kahn, our founder, great geostrategist, saw the interaction of strategy, technology, demography, and policy is shaping the future in unconventional ways that more nearsighted analysts couldn't see. And this has been core to our mission since our founding in 1961, core to America's ability to stay ahead of its competitors and rogue threats. We do significant work on defense policy, on IT, telecommunications, IT, have key initiatives on defense technology cooperation, biodefense, quantum computing, missile defense. We've also done a significant amount of work on space policy, particularly in the defense sector, and have done the first real studies over a decade ago in China's attempt at space dominance. Now, the initiative that brings us together today is Space 2.0, an important Hudson initiative that recognizes that maintaining U.S. leadership in space at a time of profound transformation and growth in the industry and its allied fields in the face of global competition warrants a reevaluation of the U.S. political and legal landscape governing space. And I'm pleased to say that the Trump administration gets this message through its National Space Council led by Vice President Pence, through the Space Policy Directive signed by the President, transforming the regulatory framework governing launch and other issues critical to space has really been an important activity for this administration. We launched this series with a kickoff event in May, featuring the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, Scott Pace. In July, we had a dialogue with the lead cabinet official, the person who's taken the lead in the cabinet on space issues, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. And today we have another extraordinary event in this series. We get to hear from Fcc Chairman Ajit Pai, who has just returned from Dubai and the big ITU meeting during what he has commissioned as termed Space Month. The FCC is announcing some bold reforms to ensure that America maintains its lead during this new space age. And also NASA's Associate Administrator for Strategy and Plans, Thomas Kremens, who's been working closely with the FCC on these matters. I want to offer heartfelt thanks to our Space 2.0 Advisory Board, Dr. Joe Pelton, Dale Hatfield, legendary figures in space telecommunications for the significant time they put into this effort. I want to thank Hudson trustee Margaret Whitehead for spearheading, getting us to think of this important initiative and drawing on her insights and her contacts here. So our event today is going to have two parts, and we're going to get underway in about 2 seconds. First, we'll have keynote remarks from Tom Kremens, who is the Associate Administrator for Strategy and Plans at NASA. And afterwards, we'll have Chairman Pai in conversation with Hudson Senior Fellow Charles Birchcott-Roth. And then we'll have questions and answers with all three men after that. So let me just go a little bit through Tom Kremens' background. He's been with NASA for 25 years and has held numerous critical positions within the organization. He's done just about everything but pilot the space shuttle. He joined NASA in 1993 as a Russian affairs specialist at the Office of Spaceflight and in Houston, eventually transferred to NASA headquarters, has handled such issues as holding positions that supported the joint Russia-American spaceflight programs, with the Russians, lead negotiator for the International Space System, has held lead management positions in exploratory systems, development, integration of strategy, space operations, international partnerships, organizational development, legislative liaison, and strategic assessments. And he has been now for the 3.5 years Associate Administrator for Strategy and Plans and Acting Chief of Staff to NASA Administrator Bridenstine. Without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Associate Administrator to the platform.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, real pleasure to be here, and I commend the FCC for having a space month. When I got the call about appearing, I thought there was static on the line. I thought it was bad communications, but my hat's off to you, and because we really share the passion about this concept, and I love the Space 2.0 because that's kind of how we're viewing this new age with a lot more players getting involved in space, a lot more activity, and we're really want to be leading and helping help create the environment, help create the relationships, help create the base for industry to really take off in this new era in space. And I'll touch on that a little bit. Great introduction. It's been a while since I've interacted with the Hudson Institute, but those topics are also timely right now in space. I know you guys have focused on geostrategy for across many domains. Space domain is really joining a lot of those things that have affected us in the geostrategic area over time, which I've had the pleasure to work on some. So I wanted to go back in time a little bit since I'm not a big spectrum guy, so I'm going to fill in some things just to give context around the current moment. We've been involved with helping push U.S. industry, helping drive technology since the inception of NASA. We're on our 60th year. In 1960, we put up the first communication satellite called Echo, and I was brushing off my memory of it, and I forgot the thing was this huge balloon that inflated once it was in orbit. It was enormous. It was almost filled the whole assembly place down at Langley where they first tested it. And we literally were bouncing signals off of that to begin the space age. And then NASA was at the forefront in the early 90s with the Advanced Telecommunications Satellite, which really helped lay the table for this current Space 2.0, demonstrating it was really a platform for industry, broad range of commercial partners to test out new approaches, new ways to prove that we could switch, to prove we could do secure communication, financial communications, to open up spot beams. So I thank that every time I watch my favorite Premier League game on Saturday morning. That all was something that emerged in that early 90s that NASA had a role in there. We became acutely dependent for our own mission needs on space, and that continues today. We've got a range of satellites. We're basically on every planet of the solar system at this point. We're communicating with Voyager, which now is about 1 billion miles away. So the space communications, we've had to stay kind of at the forefront for our own needs. So in the 80s and 90s, we started putting up the TDRS satellites, which we continue to rely on today as our space to ground, our long duration and constant comm backbone for our missions. I guess where I would say now, driving into the future, we're really encouraged to see the emerging independent commercial operators, commercial concepts, commercial systems that are emerging for low Earth orbit. We've kind of shifted now to being, hopefully, buying services more from commercial in the future, making our traditionally government backbone system open to on-ramping commercial purchases, commercial partners. We've also been working on pushing the technology. So we've got something that's going to get launched next year called the Laser Communications Relay Demonstration. That's going to be the first laser demonstration of a communications, and that'll be followed in 2022 with a mission to Psyche, which is a comet where we'll be using that for the first time. It'll have a laser, an ability to communicate both ways with a laser. Will be the backbone for that mission, the comm for that mission. So that's kind of where we're going in terms of pushing the technology and letting industry kind of drive the applications. So it all comes back again to for us, connecting technology to people, just like on the industry side, you're trying to broaden that, and then connecting our people in space to Earth. So that's an area that I wanted to kind of give a short story there of how we used to just be able to, the crews would be able to talk maybe once a week, kind of like being in a submarine, to their loved ones, to the ground. In the early part of the space station program, about 15 years ago now, we put voice over internet protocol on the space station. And that's revolutionized the psychology, support, the interaction, and I think what will be as humanity moves out into the solar system and starts living and working in space permanently, that's going to be such a key part, is to have your connection back to Earth. So I experienced this. I had a close friend who was up on orbit, and he used to call me on the weekends because he could, just to catch up on stuff. So I was talking to him one day, and he hadn't been to our house up in the DC area. He was a friend from Texas, and he had just visited before he went up into space. He said, "Tom, do I hear hardwood floors in the background?" So he could tell the timber in the background that our carpet had gone up and we had hardwood floors. And as I was about to lose comm with him, he said, "Hey, I'll call you back next time around." He was British. I'm not going to say his name, but he was British, as my horrible British accent. So about an hour later, 90 minutes later, I'm out raking leaves, and my daughter, who was about 8 at the time, opens the door and she's, "Dad, it's Uncle Mike again from the space station." I was on the line with Jenny. Can you kind of get this over with? So what a change, you know, in our world, where that's making a phone call from space is an inconvenience to some people in their day-to-day routine. So fast forwarding here just to the connection to you all and to these issues. As was mentioned, we've got the President and the Space Council have laid the groundwork with 3 very important policy initiatives. And Space Policy Directive 1, which we can talk about some other time or later, is our charge, NASA's charge, to lead an effort to go back to the moon and onto Mars and beyond with commercial and international partners. So that takes up a lot of our time, takes up a lot of my time. But in addition, we've also, it was referenced, Space Directive, Policy Directive 2 is about challenging commerce and transportation to create a very permissive regulatory environment to help stimulate and enable what we feel is this real burgeoning commercial initiative innovation that's already been unleashed, but we want to see that, fire that up and see that get going. We have, as NASA, we have a big interest in that, including we don't want to stay in low Earth orbit forever. So we've been in low Earth orbit with the space station for 20 years now. We're ready to move out. We want to leave behind a vibrant commercial market that we can continue to buy services from communications to supporting our crews, living and training and doing follow-on work in orbit. So it's really important, the regulatory environment and the hopeful explosion of greater commercial activity in low Earth orbit is a real bang-on for our efforts. So I just wanted to point that out. And then Space Policy Directive 3, which is aimed at better space traffic management and sharing data. We're very involved in that on the civil side, because we've got people living on a very large platform, but also for our other missions, we're very cognizant about protecting the space environment. So to have a successful Space 2.0 and to have this future that we all want to see, we very much share with FCC that spirit and passion as well, to keep the space environment managed in a sustainable way that can support satellite users as well as people going forward. So thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cremens, for those remarks. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, our Chairman Ajit Pai of the FCC. Chairman Pai needs no introduction, and I'm not going to give him the detailed introduction which you all can find at the FCC website or any number of other places. I'm just going to give a bit more of a personal introduction. His educational background, impeccable. His experience before he came to the commission, without parallel. His knowledge of communications law, you can ask him any obscure communications law case, and he'll give you the citation and who said what and exactly what all of that means.
Let's not test that proposition, though.
He is courageous. He takes positions and sticks with them, and he is exactly the sort of person that I think everyone wants to have in the position that he has. He has been a great representative of the United States around the world on communications issues. He's just returned from Dubai, and let me just say, we have this great image here, and I just love it. I somehow think of 2001 Space Odyssey from my childhood, but you get this image of something without people, and at the end of the day, a lot of the way the world works is it's all about people, and Chairman Pai very much relates to people, to all kinds of people, and he's just returned from Dubai, and I want to just mention the name of Doreen Botkin, and I want to ask you, Mr. Chairman, why should everyone know that name? And tell us a bit about who she is and what she's going to be doing.
Well, first and foremost, Harold, thank you so much for that warm introduction, entirely undeserved praise. I can't say how much I've enjoyed our friendship and your wise counsel over the years, and to be able to come back to Hudson about a year and a half after we introduced the concept of the Office of Economics and Data, now the Office of Economics and Analytics, is a tremendous privilege. So thanks to you, to the entire Hudson team, for opening your doors literally and figuratively to an interloper from Southwest DC. Doreen is fantastic. Those of you who don't know her, she was recently elected to a position as the head of the Telecommunications Development Bureau, or BDT as it is known, of the International Telecommunications Union. The ITU is a branch of the United Nations that handles telecommunications issues for the entire world. Her election was notable for a number of different reasons. Number one, she's an American. We haven't had an American elected to a position at the ITU for many, many years. Number two, most notably, she's the first woman to be elected to a position at the ITU in the ITU's 153-year history. Very significant milestone. Number three, and I think most importantly to the point of your question, she spent a quarter of a century, the bulk of her professional life, focused on development. She truly believes in closing the digital divide, not just in America, her home country, but really around the world. She's set up architecture at the ITU to allow regulators from the developing world and developed world to communicate, to share best practices. She's been on the ground. I mean, she was telling me recently about trips she's taken to Turkmenistan. I was with her in Panama. I mean, she really believes in this effort. And so to those countries around the world who are struggling with issues of connectivity, I hope they know, I hope this audience knows, that they will never find a better advocate for their cause than Doreen Bogdan-Martin. It was a privilege to be able to work with the State Department, the Department of Commerce, and the White House to help her along the way. But at the end of the day, her credentials, her experience, her poise, her judgment, her leadership, I think spoke for itself. And to watch her and her husband relish in the first ballot victory was something that I will never forget. I was just pleased to be a very tiny cog in a really big wheel, helping Doreen motor down the road.
Well, tell us about World Radio Conference and the U.S. role there and the FCC's role at work and how you see that going forward.
I think it's a really collaborative relationship. One of the things I found in this job, which I didn't anticipate, not having been in this job previously, was the extent to which we do have the ability to share on a bilateral and multilateral basis some of the things we're learning in the United States, but more importantly for me, some of the things that other countries are doing that we can incorporate into our own decision making. Just this last week, I was struck in bilateral meetings I had with members from Rwanda and Netherlands and Singapore and Thailand and all these other countries, is that they were struggling with some of these same problems, and they're coming up with creative solutions that hopefully we can incorporate as well. And so in the lead up to the World Radio Communications Conference, we're hopeful that we can advance policies on the international stage that will allow the private sector to do what it does best. As the Associate Administrator is pointing out, it's always hard to foresee how innovation and investment will, where it will take us, but we believe that a market-based framework is the best one for promoting private sector innovation, and that's something we hope to advance next year. And certainly over the last several days in Dubai that I was there, we saw great interest in what the United States is doing to get rid of some of the regulatory underbrush, really have a forward-looking market-based vision for the marketplace, and then let consumers enjoy the benefits that come from the digital revolution.
Well, Mr. Crimmins was talking about the history of NASA from its early days to its forward-looking position now that, well, to paraphrase space, the final frontier, people working and living in space, and a lot of this has to do also with enormous commercial opportunities. Tell us, what were your reactions to his talk?
It was incredible. I mean, not just for the vision he had going forward, but also for the context that he offered. And I want to thank Associate Administrator Crimmins, the Administrator Bridenstine, the entire NASA team for your leadership in space over the last several decades, and also going forward for your partnership with the FCC. I think we're all on the same page when it comes to wanting to promote American leadership in space. And so I really enjoyed your remarks and look forward to working with you and the entire NASA team going forward. I will say, however, after this event is done, I would like the number for your daughter, if it's possible. It sounds like technically what Uncle Mike might have been doing was placing a robocall to her. You're off. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. We'll be happy to take a look, and we can sanction him as appropriate for that. But no, in all seriousness, though, I think we really enjoyed hearing how, I think we live in the day-to-day, so it's very hard to think about long-term trends in the communications marketplace. It's hard to imagine how far we have come so quickly. When I was a kid, space meant watching the space shuttle launch at school on a broadcast television station and a wireline phone plugged into the wall. And now my kids will think of space in a very, very different way. So I'm excited to see through NASA's leadership, through the private sector's leadership, where this is going to take us. It's a bold new frontier, and I think we're only starting to see little glimpses of that. And it brings to my mind, at least, what Chairman Newt Minow, our distinguished predecessor from the early 1960s, said when he advised President Kennedy, communication satellites are going to be more important than launching a man into space because, as he put it, communication satellites launch ideas which will last beyond the lifetimes of men and women who make it into the final frontier. I truly believe that Chairman Minow's vision is coming true, and I can't wait to see how it evolves.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the great ideas that have been launched. One of the great services that Americans use many times a day is GPS.
Yes.
And there may be other satellite systems in the world. And can you tell us a bit about how the American consumer might be able to benefit from choices or in just what the American position is on satellite position services going forward?
Definitely. Well, this is something we're really excited about. Most Americans, I think, are familiar with the global positioning system, a US-based system that allows people to have much more precision as to where they are and where they're going. Well, one of the things we're going to be voting on next Thursday at the FCC is a proposal to allow non-federal devices in the US, essentially people with smartphones and the like, to be able to access Europe's version of GPS, which is known as Galileo. And this is something that's going to have a huge benefit for consumers. They will have more resiliency, more reliability, greater precision whenever they're using some of these devices. And it has applications beyond trying to figure out the quickest way to get to the Hudson Institute from Virginia, which I know most people are concerned about. Of course, absolutely. But it's also things like precision agriculture and the like. And so I think there are commercial applications too, where this new access to, I guess, another generation of GPS will benefit consumers. So hopefully that gets across the finish line next week, and consumers will see the benefits thereafter.
There's also been a lot of interest in low Earth orbit satellite systems, and the FCC, you've provided licenses to a great many applicants in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about those and what you see as the future of these constellations of low Earth orbit satellites?
The technical experts like the Associate Administrator could describe how it works in much more technical detail. All I know is how cool it is to be able to say that we are now able to envision a technology that allows hundreds, if not thousands, of these satellites to be launched into low Earth orbit and provide access to the internet at a speed and a latency and even a price point that is comparable to what you would get from a terrestrial provider. But that requires the FCC at least to not be a bottleneck, to speed up the process of granting those applications. And I'm proud to say under our leadership over the last 21 months, we've granted some of those applications, something like 21 I think were on file at one time. We've now granted, I believe, 9 of those. Next week we'll be voting on granting an additional 4. That leaves 6 more pending. 2 of them have been withdrawn in the time since. But the ones next week are kind of interesting. 2 of them involve existing NGSOs, SpaceX, for example, and Telesat, allowing them to use more frequencies in the V-band, as it is called. But 2 of them involve new NGSOs. One, Kepler, has an interesting idea about Internet of Things connectivity, and the second one, LeoSat, which is looking to provide better connectivity for enterprises and underserved communities. And our vision here is pretty simple: just allow there to be a framework for innovation that allows these NGSOs to get up and running. And let's see in the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of space, which ones work, and hopefully consumers can have more choices and make an informed decision.
Well, if I counted right, that's more than a dozen of these satellite constellations that you've granted licenses to. And so it's not the case, though, that some government agency is going to pick a winner. It's all just going to be, the market's going to determine which of these is going to succeed.
Absolutely. I think the worst thing the government can do in pretty much any market, but especially one as dynamic as the technology marketplace, is to look upon an audience of people and just pick out which ones are going to be your friends. And I think that's essentially the market-based vision we've tried to introduce over the last 22 months, is create a framework that allows anybody to invest and to innovate and to create, and ultimately the marketplace, led by millions of consumers making decisions, will be able to decide which one is the best one to promote the public interest.
That's great. The FCC Space Month.
Yeah.
Tell us about Space Month.
Yeah, we're really excited about it. I mean, I think in part I've always had a fascination with space. I just look at this visual. I mean, my best friend growing up had an entire wall which was nothing but this picture. And so I remember just looking at that wall thinking, my God, can you believe we actually sent someone? I mean, it still amazes me that 50 years ago we managed to send somebody to space.
Hardly any computer technology at all.
Yeah, I mean, the average smartphone today, as I understand it, has more computing power than the Apollo 11 module, which kind of blows my mind. I mean, I'm amazed Neil Armstrong and company were allowed to go up in space. But it's really incredible to see how far we've come. So I've always had that interest in space. And as you might imagine, in anticipation of next week's votes, trying to think very creatively about all the space movies that have been out there for incorporation into my statements. But we wanted to make sure that we emphasize that space plays a critical role, I think, in the communications marketplace. Most people think of communications as involving terrestrial systems, but increasingly, with some of the technological advancements that we've seen, space plays an important role. So the satellite industry in the United States, we want them to innovate just as anybody else would on land. And so it was important to us as we were thinking about the agenda, we had so many things involving the satellite industry, thought, well, why don't we collect them all together and highlight the importance of this industry and try to do something for them to allow them to succeed. And so as we were going through the list, obviously the NGSO applications you talked about, making it easier for consumers to gain access to Galileo as an alternative to the US-based GPS, Part 25 streamlining to allow for a unified license to get rid of some of that regulatory underbrush. Same thing with DBS to streamline the process there. In addition, something that I'm personally very interested in, Earth Stations in Motion, or eSIMs. For those of you movie fans, planes, trains, and automobiles, these are all essentially Earth stations in motion in one way or the other, and to allow non-geostationary satellite orbit companies to be able to try to target those moving vehicles and whatnot with connectivity, something that's really interesting. So anyway, we hope in the aggregate at least, it puts the United States on the map when it comes to satellite and space-based innovation in the communications marketplace. And we're really excited to see what happens a week from today.
And is this going to be an annual event in November? Is it going to be Space Month?
That's a good point. We're always open to creative ideas. Hopefully this launches, see what I did there?
Yeah.
Hopefully this launches a great deal of interest in some of the FCC's satellite-based reforms. And if there are more good ideas that we need to put on the agenda, we're open to doing that.
That's great. I could stay up here all day asking questions, and that would be selfish of me. So what I'm going to do is ask Administrator Kremens to come join us.
Sure.
And we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. And there are folks with microphones. When you ask a question, please identify yourself and ask your questions. And please limit it to just questions about space.
Including my socks, if you like. So.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's a well-oiled machine. I'm telling you,
Wow.
we're always on message when it comes to this stuff. So.
Impressive. All right. Who is going to have the first question here? Stunned silence. Right over here. Tom Duesterberg. Please.
Is this on?
It is.
Tom Duesterberg from the Hudson Institute. Both of you talked about hoping to rely on commercial services in space. But we all know that for both economic and national security reasons, we need a fair amount of security. And we also know that we have a number of competitors who are trying to become competitive or even dominant in space. Can you just, in a general way, tell us how you think about, for instance, the competition from China, how you look at products and services that may be a problem for either security or the competitiveness of U.S. technological firms?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so those are significant issues, particularly for a government agency that has critical missions. So I don't want to leave the impression that we think we're just going to be buying everything we need overnight, or even that will fully satisfy some of our more exquisite in terms of you can't, when you're supporting an EVA from the space station, every second and we've got the best interpreters in the world, probably better than interpreters at the UN or anywhere, the communications is the key part of supporting some of our most life-critical operations, docking, those kinds of things, where you can't afford any blackout or any drop, any risk. We've also got exquisite satellites and science missions that are beyond what are even on the table right now to be buying from in the near term. So I was expressing more how we hope, as this continues to mature and evolve, certainly for some of our more basic, just like DoD buys about, I think 70–80% of gets their comm through commercial satellites, having resiliency, having depth, having multiple options. To answer your other question, from a strategic standpoint, that's good for the United States and our strategic posture. And if those are commercial systems, all the better, because then that means there's other people using those. So it fits into our overall strategic plan for how we want to go in this area. But then the devil's in the details of the architecture you put together and how you shape the architecture we've got now, which is very much a government-driven architecture, including what we support for other national security users, even outside of NASA's area.
I would agree with that. And I would simply say, from an FCC perspective, that only reinforces the importance of updating our rules to promote the US-based industry so that they have the maximum possible incentive to develop some of those next-generation systems that will give us access to next-generation connectivity.
Gentleman by the window.
Gary Barnhart, Extraordinary Innovative Space Partnerships. Over the years, there's been an awful lot of technology that effectively has been stranded on the wrong side of the technology development valley of death for any number of reasons. relating to communications. You have the evolution of cognitive software-defined radio, which gives you tremendous flexibility with respect to adaptive systems, the notion of interoperable network communication architectures, the convergence of both RF and optical electronics backends, the dynamic allocation of bandwidths, delay and disturbance tolerant networking. What can be done to alter both, I guess, the regulatory environment, and how do we foster moving these technologies forward in this new era?
I can take the first crack. From our perspective, at least, what we've tried to do is make sure that the FCC doesn't stand as a gatekeeper for some of those next generation technologies. So for example, one of the things that we've tried to do is breathe life into Section 7 of the Communications Act. Section 7, which was a dead letter for the 33 years before I came into office, it requires the FCC to rule in a new application or service within 1 year of its proposal. We're trying to put some teeth into that to make sure that we give innovators some certainty. In addition to that, we've expanded our experimental license framework to allow for some of those technologies to flourish. We'll see what works through these experiments. And additionally, we've worked very extensively with our Office of Engineering and Technology. Julie Knapp and the entire team in the FCC's OET have been fantastic about highlighting some of these next generation technologies for us and letting us see into the future, because I think that's one of the things that's important for us is, if we don't know about the technology, then we certainly can't speed its development. In addition to that, I just take a personal interest in it. Recently, for example, when I was in Delhi, I took some time and met with some Li-Fi innovators, Li-Fi being essentially the optical transmission of, instead of through radio waves, you would use light. And I don't claim to know the physics of it, but I've got to say it's really interesting to hear how some of these Li-Fi innovators see it as a real alternative to the radio wave-based transmission of information. It's exciting to see, and I'm always looking to learn more from the best and brightest out there.
And I think, Gary, what I would add in terms of the Valley of Death part, we've got we're very sensitive to that. I think the laser communications area is one I mentioned that's where we saw that there needed to be something to take it from that very low technology area to actually demonstrate something and then bring in industry to try to help to port it out more broadly while protecting the national security interests, as the other gentleman alluded to, that comes with some of these more advanced technologies. So that's an area where, but we have other areas like that. We mentioned, I think you mentioned RF advances. We took something off a F-18 platform that had never flown in space on an S-band capability, and we put it on actually a Indian Chandrayaan mission and flew it to the moon, first time to demonstrate that in space. And then we followed it up actually with a lunar mission that we flew. You're probably familiar with, where we put L-band on there and demonstrated that for the first time, which now is becoming passé. It's almost, that was back 12 years ago, and that was got it through the valley, and now it's well beyond the valley. It's being used broadly out there. So, and the other piece I think, as the chairman alluded to, is being cognizant of where those developments are coming from, and then being smart as a government as a whole, not just in our NASA stovepipe, but working across the government sector. So we're not duplicating, or we're not bumping into where others are investing, and we're not bumping into where there's already a strong industry presence trying to pull that through that valley. So you got to find that sweet spot in those applications.
The young lady in the...
The idea is that one of the things you can do is that there's opportunities evolving with the International Space Station, where instead of it being a conflict between the FCC and NASA, that you would be a partnership.
You bet.
To move these technologies forward.
You bet. You bet.
The young lady in the third row.
Thank you. I'm Teresa Hitchens with the University of Maryland Center for International Security Studies and the previous director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva. So I would like to ask you, Chairman Pai, about the issue of LEOSat constellations. As you know, there are quite a number of proposals out there. If every one of them was successful, we'd have jumped from something like 1,800 satellites to 18,000 satellites in LEO. A lot of those are very short-lived, 5 years or so. And yet our current debris regulations in LEO talk about bringing something down within 25 years. If you've got hundreds of satellites that have to be replaced every 5 years and all of those 100 satellites are dead, you have a serious problem in the increase in debris. And I understand that FCC wants to encourage these companies, because I want to see these companies encouraged too, but what do we do about the debris problem?
It's a fantastic question, and it highlights a glaring omission from my quick recitation to Commissioner Furchby Roth about what is on tap next week. One of the critical things that is going to be on tap, in fact, I believe it's the second thing we'll be voting on, is a long overdue update of our orbital debris rules. Those rules were established in 2004. And it occurred to us that given some of the technological developments in the industry, given some of the new mitigation techniques that are out there, it might be useful for us to update those rules. And so that's one of the things we'll be looking at. If you're interested, it's on the FCC's website and on my Medium post. I think we've linked to it. You can actually see exactly what we're proposing in terms of disclosure rules, indemnification of to the United States, all kinds of different things like that. And so if you have any questions following up on that, we'd be happy to hear from you. But orbital debris is going to be a critical thing going forward. As you said, it's a much more crowded room, so to speak, and so we want to make sure we have rules in place to protect against debris. I think all of us saw the movie Gravity, and we don't want what happened to Sandra Bullock to happen to all of us.
Amen.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, retired. With the growth in LEO satellites, you start looking at issues of physical space, the orbital parameters, and how you fit these guys in there without interfering with each other. At the same time, especially using non-directional uplink antennas, which is what's going to happen with a lot of these communication systems, you start worrying about spectral allocation. I'm wondering, what is the situation right now? This has to be internationally coordinated. What is the situation on coordinating all this internationally? Is there one go-to place for both spectrum and physical space? Is that an issue? Is that a problem?
From a spectrum perspective, at least, we've tried to make sure that all companies have access to the spectrum that they need. In fact, the two NGSO applications I mentioned earlier, and part of that involves broadening the authorization of two companies to be able to use V-band to make sure that they're able to provide connectivity. And that's one of the things, just generally speaking, the FCC has prioritized, is making sure that we give the industry some certainty. Even, for example, with respect to the 28 gigahertz band, which the auction for which will start for 5G terrestrial spectrum next week, that involves spectrum from 27.5 to 28.35, I believe it is. But for the other parts of 28 gigahertz, we wanted to make sure we gave the satellite industry some certainty as to what they were going to be able to access. The same thing with about 4 gigahertz of spectrum that we reserved from 40 to 42, and then 48 to 50. So in terms of spectrum anyway, the US at least is taking a leading role, I think, in giving satellite operators some certainty and some additional spectrum. In terms of how do we coordinate everyone who's up there, that's obviously very complicated and requires international coordination. And thus far, at least, it's been somewhat like herding cats. Obviously, everyone wants to send a lot of stuff up there, and a lot of different governments have an interest in that. But thus far, at least, it's worked pretty harmoniously for the most part. Every now and then there's a hiccup, but it's, at least from my perspective at least, it's been a pretty smooth coordination.
I would agree, and you got the football, so on that. But
yeah,
from our point of view, that's why I alluded to it. We have an acute interest in making sure that low Earth orbit stays sustainable. Yeah. You're going to have people living and working there, and we've been launching CubeSats off the space station for several years now, and we've been able to work through that just in terms of where we place those so that they naturally burn in fairly quickly. So there, you can use, as you know well, I can tell, space to help you manage the problem challenge as well.
Yeah.
Question in the front row here.
Ross Vincenti with Intelsat. Space is hard. It's really hard. We know that. Is it sufficient to simply, as you say, clear away the regulatory underbrush, or should the government, should FCC, other agencies do more to actively promote and subsidize the development of space? Is it just enough to clear away the regulatory underbrush and not pick winners and losers, or should they actually be doing more, do you think?
So when it comes to direct government support for particular companies or even a sector of the industry, I tend to be a little bit skeptical. I mean, I think that history has taught us that, at least in the United States anyway, the marketplace for communications has been most successful when the government steps back and allows the market forces to operate to the benefit of not just individual companies, but overall consumers. And there are some exceptions to that. For example, in the context of our Universal Service Fund, one of the things that was important to me in terms of getting more connectivity out there was to allow satellite companies to compete for that scarce funding. And I'm proud to say that a satellite company in particular won a significant amount of money at our recent Connect America Fund auction to provide broadband at a relatively high speed and low latency to thousands of consumers who heretofore have not been able to get on the right side of the digital divide. But in terms of the government going out and directly subsidizing companies, that's something that I just instinctively resist. I just think it ends up distorting the marketplace, distorting investment decisions for particular players who aren't the beneficiaries of that largesse, and ultimately it leads to too cozy, I think, a relationship between government and industry.
Yeah,
But I don't.
yeah, no, I would resonate with that, and we've been trying to be very careful about how we do that and trying to provide infrastructure that others can use. You know, ACS was an example of that, but there are others. The space station, as was stated, we've been trying to allow that to be a platform that people can demonstrate, try out, can work their ideas, but we're providing kind of an equal access to that infrastructure for them to try that out, along with a good regulatory environment, a good ability to get their things up to space. So that's, I think we share that common approach.
Question in the back? Yeah.
My name is Bert Ryan. You know, it's been, from early days, a government function to assign areas of the spectrum to different uses, both domestically and internationally. And as technology expands, it may be that the uses assigned are no longer the best uses. How do you envision, from the FCC point of view, putting more dynamism into that function of coordinating use areas?
That's a great question. So I think I would offer two different answers, one short-term and one more medium to long-term. I think in the short term, at least, one of the things we've tried to prioritize is allowing the flexible use of spectrum. Instead of saying, okay, here's a public resource, we will circumscribe the uses to which you can put this resource. We've generally speaking said, here's a resource, use it as you believe is the best. And ultimately, going to Harold's economic roots, assuming we keep transaction costs low, ultimately that resource will be deployed for its highest valued use. And I think that's something that the wireless industry in particular, where we've seen some of the success is, once we stopped putting our thumb on the scale in favor of a particular use, the marketplace developed very quickly. And our hope is same thing will happen with space, that we're not going to dictate how different satellite companies can use some of that spectrum. As I pointed out, for the V-band authorizations we're going to use next week, or NGSO authorizations we're going to hopefully approve next week, companies have very different ideas about how to use some of that spectrum. And we believe, at least, that's the smarter way to go. Instead of dictating the results, just put the spectrum out there for the commercial marketplace to use. But to the interesting aspect to your question, I think, is in the medium and long term. And that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, what is the role of the FCC in spectrum policy in the long run? And at the end of, just recently I announced we're going to be holding a forum on artificial intelligence and machine learning on November 30th. And it's not inconceivable to me that 50 years from now, people are going to sit there and wonder, my God, there were actually people who sat in a building in Washington and wrote on pages how spectrum was going to be allocated and used. And because it could well be that we'll have algorithms to determine the most efficient user at the most efficient time in the most appropriate place. And this will all be determined dynamically. And I know it sounds crazy today, but 50 years ago, if you describe our marketplace today, I think people would have thought you were crazy as well. So I can imagine the automation of spectrum policy using technologies like AI and machine learning, or maybe even blockchain, in very innovative ways, and getting people out of the process and allowing it to be much more efficient.
That's a great vision. My only concern, and why I think it's important for U.S. the U.S. to be leading is in establishing the norms of behavior that support a platform that is running in the background, that's efficient, but within a system that has established norms and has our leadership in helping shape that, going back kind of the first question of how can the U.S. provide that leadership envelope for that to occur.
Definitely. That's a great, yeah, that's an important caveat.
We will take a couple more questions and probably have to let our government officials get back to work. Gentleman in the back.
Ivan Fomin from the Russian Embassy. My questions, I have two questions, if you permit, and they are about, of course, Russia. First is to Mr. Kremis. How do you see NASA-Roscosmos relations after 2020? And second one to Mr. Pai, you mentioned about Galileo, European project Galileo. Could you please tell us more about your interaction with Russian partners with GLONASS system? Thank you.
Okay. Спасибо для вашего вопроса.
Man, that was
I think there'll be a strong relationship. We had the ambassador was over today and met with my boss this morning and talked about this a little bit. The cooperative effort was and has always been based upon two very established programs, and Russia has a great history, has a great current program. So I think you're alluding to maybe that the relationship will change. We're going to be riding on commercial vehicles, not solely on Soyuz as we are now, but I think that's a healthy thing. You know, when we formed our partnership, in addition to the geopolitical reasons for it, there was a strong desire not to create a space station that was dependent upon only one way to get there. And the wisdom of that was borne out after the Columbia tragedy, where Russian vehicles kept the space station literally in orbit until we got back flying again. So having resiliency, having depth is in both our countries' interests, I think. We're going to be flying our crews. We're going to continue to fly Russian crews on our commercial vehicles, as you may or may not know, and we plan to still fly our crews. And so it's a common operation once we get to that's the beauty of space station. It's not talking about cooperation, it's intimately living it. So I think there's that model, there's a lot of potential as we move out towards the moon to continue to build upon where we have areas of interest, areas that we want to pursue, and where Russia has its own areas of competency, areas of interest it wants to pursue. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities to continue to look at how to bring those together, and we're starting to already talk about some of that for post-2020.
As to your second question, I have not had the opportunity yet to meet my counterparts in the Russian Federation. I would have to defer to our International Bureau, and in particular our fantastic chief, Tom Sullivan, who I believe may have had those contacts. And so I would have to report back at a later date on how those conversations have gone. And that, by the way, I should have mentioned this in my response to Harold's question. I want to give out a special thanks to Tom, the fantastic team in the International Bureau. They've represented the United States when it comes to the satellite industry quite well, and they do heroic work to make things like Space Month possible. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the career staff at the FCC for the tremendous work that they have done. We get the credit by having events like this, but really they are the ones who handle the laboring oar with such dedication. And I'm just grateful to call myself a coworker of theirs.
We're going to take one more question, and then afterwards, our guests will, I'm sure, take a few questions on as they have to leave. But who's going to get the last question? Lady over here.
Hi, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. As you were talking about allowing more low orbit satellites into space, does that mean that you were planning to approve a lot of applications and kind of let the market decide which applications consumers like? So are you kind of opening up the chute for a lot more of these applications in space is, I guess, what I'm asking for clarification on.
Yes, that's the idea. I mean, for example, we've published one of the NGSO applications for a vote next week, and that involves not just authorizing them to use certain V-band frequencies, but also allowing them to get, I believe, something like 7,000 satellites in a low Earth orbit. And our hope is that by creating this essentially a mesh network of satellites, if you will, up in space, allowing other companies to do the same and using their own technologies, ultimately consumers will be the ones, especially in rural, remote, and tribal areas where it might be prohibitive for economic or technical reasons to lay a fiber line, for example. Consumers will be the ones, at least, who will determine which of those technologies should succeed. So our hope is to not be a choke point for that kind of innovation, but allow all of them to have a full and fair opportunity to innovate. And I'm really excited to see where it goes.
And with that, please join me in thanking our speakers.
Oh, thank you. Hey, really a pleasure. It's so nice to meet you. And we'd love to stay in touch, too. So, yeah, you're doing great work. So.
I appreciate your approach.